Alrighty, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, good day. Welcome to the CES Letters. My name is Easton. I'll be your host. And today I'm joined by a good friend, Michael Peterson. Michael, how are you doing?
I'm doing great.
Good.
It's great to be here.
Just a little introduction to Michael. Many of us probably haven't heard of him. He's not an ordinary scholar of the church, but instead, he and his co-author, Jacob Hess, right?
Mm-hmm.
Jacob Hess and him, they just wrote an article titled, "Were These Ever the Sincere Questions of an Earnest Truth Seeker? 10 lines of evidence that document the true origins and purpose of the CES letter."
Yes, it's an investigative study.
Right. And so when Steve Harper, my teammate, and I first saw this article, we wanted to read it. We jumped into it. We wanted to learn everything we could. And it is a very impressive article. So as we study and discuss today, we'll be kind of going through the article itself, some of the main points of reasoning. But our invitation to you is go and read this article itself. We'll have the link in the show notes below, so make sure you read it, check out everything, listen and read all the footnotes. There's hundreds of footnotes throughout, maybe not hundreds, a lot of footnotes throughout. So check out all those footnotes.
70 pages.
70 pages,
but one time I tried to take the footnotes and put them into the body just to see how long it would be, and it would be over 100 pages.
Wow.
Yeah.
So check it all out. There's a lot to study when it comes to the CES letter. And I also just kind of want to give an introduction of the majority of our podcast episodes are about the content within the CES letter, talking about the Book of Mormon translation and polygamy and whatever it may be. This episode and the next few episodes, this will be part one of a couple episodes we'll do with Michael, and we're going to do another one with Brian Hills and one with Sarah Allen, where we're talking about the CES letter itself and the author of the CES letter. So that's kind of a good introduction to all of this. And so without further ado, I present to you, Were These the Sincere Questions of an Earnest Truth Seeker with Michael Peterson. Michael, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Great. Michael, as we get started, I always ask this question to every one of our guests, just kind of as an icebreaker, get to know you a little bit. What's something about you that nobody else knows? And just as fun fact, really.
Sure. I'm very competitive. One of my bosses in a software company I worked for announced that they were going to have a best ball tournament, and all the executives that I worked with were going to be there. And I couldn't handle that. I hadn't golfed in a long time. I haven't golfed recently either, but at the time I took private lessons for a month.
Oh my goodness.
And got up early in the morning and practiced for a couple hours a day, and I managed to do fairly well in the tournament.
Wow,
but
that's impressive.
They didn't know what I had been doing.
You can't tell them. You just have to do it.
Yeah, the other thing is I've really made a decision in my life a long time ago. I had a very good mentor, a stake president, who taught me about Alma chapter 13 and what the responsibilities are for priesthood holders in terms of teaching and mentoring and bringing people along in the gospel. And so I've had a private ministry of helping people come back to the faith who have left the faith or who have become inactive. And we've seen some wonderful miracles happen with that.
That's very impressive.
And embracing the gospel of Christ again.
Well, that's amazing. God bless you. Michael, as we get started, I think a lot of people might have the concern, and as we've seen kind of the feedback to your guys' wonderful article, the concern of we're diving into Jeremy Reynolds and everything we can find about him. Is this an ad hominem attack? What would you respond to somebody who says that this might be?
So the definition of ad hominem is broader than what many people think. It goes all the way back to Aristotle. And if you do the research online, you'll see that a person's actions, and in my view, public actions, can come into play in determining what you focus on. There's a recent summary that I pulled up of web discussions on the topic of ad hominem, and there's a Canadian philosopher, Douglas Walton, quite prominent. He explained that ad hominem reasoning is not always fallacious, and that in some instances, questions of personal conduct, character, motives, etc., are legitimate and relevant to the issue, as when it directly involves actions contradicting the subject's words. So the author of the CES letter developed his own brand. He developed a sort of shtick that elevated his writings and gave them unique credibility in the minds of many readers. And we're going to go through that in a few minutes here. This brand included professed storylines about the timeline of his faith crisis, his state of mind when he wrote the essay, his purposes, and his claims about the church's supposed silence in response. That was all part of the storylines surrounding the letter that fed the letter, that made it persuasive for people to want to listen and look at it.
Sure.
And as we detail in pages 4 and 5 of the study, readers' reactions to the essay almost universally focused on these just my honest questions storylines and rhetorical packaging. If you go out on Reddit, you go out on Facebook, and you look at the history and you study it at length, you'll see probably 2 out of 3, 3 out of 4 responses, they're talking about that story.
Mm-hmm.
The first person, their first reaction on the web to the essay. They're focused on that. So without that wrapper, this author's writings, which is noted, are mostly regurgitations and repetitions of extreme anti-Latter-day Saint antagonists that go way back.
Right.
The Tanners, Grant Palmer, and Mormon think would have been immediately rejected by most believing Latter-day Saints. Instead, the false storylines elevated his writing, and we're going to prove that. We're going to demonstrate that.
Lovely.
Which is what our research uncovered. So in reality, it's actually impossible to do a credible, factual study of the whole history of the letter and its author without examining him and his story.
Right.
And as writer Carol Rice, a friend of mine, put it, he is the story. He is the brand. So it was a brand, and it was a brand of his own creation. So the evidence demonstrates that this is the case, and the other issue here is that the author's central claims were made publicly, and that's a big deal. Publicly, over several years. And so those storylines deserve a public response for the truth to be fully told and known.
Right. And something I'd like to point out to our listeners is much of the CES letter is him focusing on individual people and their story and who they are and the claims they're making. And so to me, it's only fair to do the same to him. He's looking at certain people and only judging them based off of certain things. And then he's trying to perceive himself as this specific person, but let's see the truth of everything.
Exactly. And I would also add a clarification there that this wasn't a hunt to nail somebody.
Sure.
It wasn't like that. You're criticizing the church, therefore we're going to go after you. It wasn't like that. It was more like, this story deserves to be delved into. I'll get into some of the background around that.
Great.
So this started as a project a couple of years ago after Sarah Allen released her series on the CES Letter. You're probably familiar with it.
Right. Mm-hmm. We're going to be interviewing her very soon.
I think it's one of the most incredible, wonderful breakdowns. It just leaves every argument in that letter on the floor. It's very well done. You could study for 2 years the material that she linked to. It was very, very impressive. However, and since she's already said it publicly, I don't think she'll be offended if I say this. She felt a prompting from the Spirit before she started that she should reveal what she knew about this story. And that's why she wrote that first installment before she got into the content. She did, I don't know how many, 60 to 70 postings on the content.
Mm-hmm.
But
hundreds of pages worth.
Yeah. But the first one was titled The Dishonest Origins of the CES Letter. And that got my attention. I read that. I started getting into it. I thought, and some others, we were in a writers group at the time talking, this deserves a real investigative study to really turn over every rock and try to find every fact that we can. It's that important.
Sure. It's powerful. And I will say I'm grateful for all the work that you and Jacob have put in. I've read the whole article, I think 2 or 3 times now, and it's powerful. There's a lot of things that I didn't know and a lot of shocking stuff in there. So, Michael, let's jump right into it. Where would you start as kind of a preface to our friends as we start to uncover the origins of all this?
Sure. So I made a reference to the reaction that was online from people who read it for the first time, going all the way back to when it was first published in 2013.
Yeah.
So as we were doing the research, it was fascinating to hear these comments. And they're just repeated over and over and over again. We didn't want the writing to become laborious, right? We couldn't put every single comment in here. So we plucked out a couple of them that were just very emblematic. And here's the first one. Now, I like this lady's name, Miss Sarinsky. She was on YouTube in 2021, and this was her reaction to reading the letter.
Okay.
From my understanding, the letter wasn't intended to be this big exposure of the church. Jeremy Reynolds had legitimate questions that he was seeking answers to. Why couldn't anyone just honestly answer his questions? Obviously, it's because no one has the answers. Now, if we had people in here who have the same focus on this and have researched it, they'd all be nodding their heads right now. They'd be saying, yeah, that pretty much sums up the responses.
Even though there's been hundreds of responses to the very topics in the CES letter.
The CES letter has been refuted. Every line of it has been refuted very credibly. Many scholars who have looked at it have considered it very shoddy in terms of its scholarship and in terms of its arguments and so forth. So it's not difficult to refute the CES letter. It's time-consuming,
yes,
because there's hundreds of accusations in it. And, you know, Sarah found out how time-consuming it really is.
Right, hundreds of hours.
Right, yeah. Oh, so anyway, this is the storylines that the author wrapped around the content of the essay. This is what Ms. Sarinsky is responding to. And what did those storylines consist of? The origin of the letter, of the essay, what the letter actually is, what is it? Is it a letter? Why it was written? Its audience, you know, who it was really aimed at. And the author's frame of mind when he wrote it. So all of those things were presented as a packaged story. So we call that, or the name we came up with, that it's not original, is the shiny wrapper.
Right.
So the content is inside the box, but the shiny wrapper is what caused people to pick it up. Now I'm going to use an analogy here. So if I had a book, and I'm just going to use, even though this isn't the actual book, but if this book in my hand were Mormonism, Shadow or Reality by the Tanners, and you or I were coming off our mission, or if it's a sister, she's preparing for the temple or has just come back from the temple in her sealing, and has a deep conversion, has gifts of the Spirit going in their lives, loves the gospel, loves the Savior, and is close to the Holy Ghost. And you handed that person Mormonism, Shadow or Reality. They would look at it, they would flip through it, and I'll bet you 9 out of 10 would just take it and toss it.
Right. Say, I'm okay. I don't need this.
No, they'd recognize immediately what it is.
Right.
Right. They would know immediately what it is. The author knew this. With the package framed around this content, maybe I can get you to listen to me a little bit, because this is a sympathetic story, right? Who wouldn't be attracted to a story of someone who was raised in the faith, and then when they were older, they encountered things online that caused them doubt, and then the church completely ignored them.
Right.
And it's a very compelling story. The challenge with it is what we're going to be talking about. So the author was just his storyline. He was just a disaffected and doubting member of the Church of Jesus Christ seeking answers to difficult questions.
Right.
And for purposes of restoring his faith, it was aimed
genuine questions that he was looking for the truth, is what he's saying.
And it was aimed solely at the director.
Right.
Now, he's made some other comments.
Right.
In the columns, so to speak, about
and we'll
that.
dive into that.
But in the main, the official comments, if you want to call it that, he's declared that he wrote that to the director and no one else. Okay. So and then the director and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints refused to answer him.
That's the claim.
Yes. Now, here's a couple of others that we pulled off the web. One came from YouTube in 2015. It came from a place of sincere inquiry. And this other one came from Quora. The man who wrote it designed it as a list of questions that were concerning him. He was hoping a church education system instructor might be able to provide a scholarly clarification. These are people that are just reacting
right
to the story and
they hear the story and
the content.
they enjoy the story. It's a powerful story, so they're going to dive in.
Exactly. So, right, this very thing that we're talking about.
So where do we go from here, Michael? We have all this important introduction. We have the shiny wrapper. Where do we go from here?
This is the question. Was this story true?
It's a powerful question. It's a necessary question.
We need to know, everyone needs to know, that has it in any way been touched by this essay? Was that story true? So what we learned from our investigation, to summarize it, there's 10 key takeaways. You'll see this since you've read the study, that provide unambiguous, conclusive evidence that the sincere questions from a searching heart story was far from the truth. And along the way, you'll get a front row seat to witness the whole CES Letter saga, front to back, beginning to end. So let's go through each of these points briefly. We're only going to be able to cover a few of them today, right?
This will be a part one.
In this particular session. But let's go through them briefly just so the audience can get an overview, okay?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
So number one is, so these are areas of evidence. In a court of law, we're all familiar with areas of evidence, right? You have forensic evidence,
mm-hmm.
you have digital evidence, you have personal testimony, right? You have any writings, papers, documents, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So this was composed around areas of evidence. So the first is adversarial church bashing long before the letter was written. So over a 6-month period prior to the essay ever being created, even written, the author repeatedly attacked the Church of Jesus Christ from an online persona he later openly acknowledged was his own. And this was not just 1 or 2 instances. We found 11 instances over about a 5-month period approximately. Super hostile, anti-faith postings.
Doesn't sound like somebody who's humbly wanting to find an answer to a question.
Exactly. Number 2, disinterest in available and established channels for member questions. Neither before nor after the letter was created was there any indication, and this is an extensive documentation of all interactions with church leadership, of sincere interest in receiving answers from local leaders to the concerns being promoted publicly. We'll get into depth about that. Number 3, seeking feedback from church antagonists prior to publication. So in the weeks before publishing the essay, the author actively solicited feedback and advice from some of the most hardened and hostile critics of the church online. And we're going to draw a distinction between that and crowdsourcing.
Okay.
Some have supposed that the more common definition of crowdsourcing, that he did that when he wrote the original essay. But we found that that's not totally accurate, right? That's not the issue. The issue is that he was actively soliciting feedback and advice from some of the most hardened and hostile critics of the church. So the next, number 4, is public statements revealing a much broader intended audience. In various interviews and online interactions, the author's own words revealed a clear intent that extended beyond merely getting answers to my own questions. So this came from his own words.
Mm-hmm.
Textual similarities mirroring other published dissidents. So before sending the letter, the author aligned himself with some of the most prominent and antagonistic detractors of the faith, even lifting significant portions of the original CES Letter text or rephrasing it from well-known anti-Latter-day Saint writings.
Right.
And number 6 is taking a hostile, disparaging tone in the original essay, which totally contradicts its introduction, and we're going to get into that,
mm-hmm.
Compared with the curiosity that one might expect in a list of genuine questions. The 2013 essay, the 75-page original CES essay that blew up for 2 years,
mm-hmm.
Displays an unmistakable contempt toward the faith. Number 7, immediately promoting and personally disseminating the letter online. So instead of a waiting period that you or I would normally engage in, right, after we've sent something like this off.
Wait for a response from the CES director.
I mean, a real long wait.
Yeah.
It would probably
mm-hmm.
be, a month or 2 or whatever.
Sure.
Instead, the author almost immediately began marketing the letter to a broad audience. And
sure.
We have irrefutable evidence of this. So, number 8, disparaging attitudes and manipulative actions toward local church leaders. So, once the author was asked to answer for his attempts to persuade others to leave the faith, then the author used these occasions with pastoral leaders not to seek resolution of any real questions about the faith, but instead to further attack the church. So he had hours with his stake president, which he secretly recorded. And nowhere does he make an attempt to seek in a sincere way to get his concerns resolved with the church, which I find absolutely astonishing.
Right.
He had all that opportunity. And during those years, in case I forget to mention it later, that was in 2014, a year and a half after the essay went out. And on the author's website, to this day, he makes the claim that from 2013 to 2016, he was still seeking answers through his essay. So we're only talking one step up that staircase to 2014, when he was in front of his leaders and he had this fabulous opportunity to reconcile, and he didn't. He didn't even attempt to do so.
Right.
Instead, he argued with the leadership. I've gotten too far off of this.
No, you're good.
Number 9, extensive and ongoing branding expansion efforts over subsequent years. So the marketing and promotion of the essay didn't ever stop. It continued with an enormous investment over subsequent years and continuing to this day. And what was marketed? What was the brand? It's the story, right? And we can talk a little more about that on another occasion. But
it's the narrative
for people
that he
who
created.
have really gotten into marketing and understand it, you need a story to really do a great promotion. In this case, it was the story that we're discussing here. Number 10, malicious personal attacks upon anyone who dared to disagree. So when concerns were raised about some of these very points, rather than taking seriously the objections being raised, the author would employ mean-spirited attacks on the messengers, including those not of our faith. There's a lot of name-calling. There's a lot of nastiness. Everyone is an unofficial apologist who dares to do this. He's accused anyone who goes into the history of what we're discussing today of stalking him. There's some other, we'll get more in detail about this, but there's a lot of attempts to prejudice the audience against those who are trying to reveal what the truth is. And it's not, at this point, unexpected, right?
Exactly. Absolutely.
Everybody's dishonest.
Right.
If you oppose me or you oppose what I've presented to the world publicly, then you're dishonest.
Right. Or the common thing we see a lot on our social media is you're gaslighting. That's by definition not what we're doing. We're just looking through the truth and trying to give a different perspective to these things.
Yeah, and to get off on another tangent about gaslighting. But that has been used a lot online in these kinds of discussions in ways that are so broad that the term has just gotten so watered down that it's really an ineffective, it's become quite ineffective in dialogue just because of how watered down it's become, as I said.
And so, Michael, I think these are important 10 points, and in your article you go in depth, and that's kind of what we're going to go to. So my first question that I'd have is the CES letter was written in April 2013. That's when it was published.
It was written between, I believe, March 20th and April 13th, something like that.
So right there in that springtime of
2013. It was published on the 20th, or roughly in that, give or take a few days, somewhere in that time frame, about a week later.
So the first point you bring up is there was adversarial church bashing long before the letter was written. Could you give us the timeline? What does that timeline look like from months before when he started bashing the church online to the actual publication of the letter?
Okay, let's go through that. So it actually started about 9 months before. So the author created his own church hostile online handle, his pseudonym, Colabot, and he created a subtitle, a flare, "I'm on a taper." And we don't know when the flare was added. There wasn't a way to really research that I could find. But we do know from the actual Reddit record that Colabot was created in July of 2012. Now, for those who have been out, who, like myself, like to defend the faith, right? And we get in dialogue with people who are opposed to the faith sometimes. That word kolabat is a derivative word of kolob. And I think everyone would agree that when that term is used in talking in general about Latter-day Saints or the faith, it's done in a derogatory way to bash the faith.
Right.
I mean, the average Latter-day Saint doesn't talk much about kolob.
Not really.
It would be like talking
Not much to learn about.
It would be like talking about the third nephew of Abraham
Right.
in Genesis 58,
Mm-hmm.
or Genesis 48 or something.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't on an everyday basis do that.
Right.
But by coming out, as we say here, online as kolabat, is right away a very deeply embedded mock of the faith under this name.
Mm-hmm.
Now, where does the author come out? The location.
It's Reddit, right?
It's Exmo Reddit.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the more hostile anti-Latter-day Saint channels you could ever go to. And it's got, it's no holds barred out there against the faith. There is religious bigotry on that channel on a regular basis. There is some of the most ugly and vile things said about the church and its members, and as well as arguing against the truthfulness of faith and everything. And I think it's very telling that all of these post-production or post-writing postings that he made were in that venue.
Right.
So I'm kolabat, that's mocking your faith, and I'm out here in the place where the hardest mocks of your faith occur, and this is where I'm going to make my postings.
Mm-hmm.
So this wasn't in kind of a neutral place on Facebook or somewhere where people are just in a friendly way bantering back and forth about the church, and some agree and some don't. This is a very hardened anti-church venue.
Right.
All right.
And so when does he start posting?
He starts posting in October, and in his first post, he attacks President Brigham Young and the truthfulness of modern prophets. This was on the issue of plural marriage.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just a flat-out attack of a living prophet. And then, in the same month, on October 10th, he mocks the church in an open letter to Quentin L. Cook of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And this was in response to a church conference talk that Elder Cook had done a few days earlier, where he was cautioning about online information that attacks the faith. That was one of the subjects that he covered in that talk. But there's something really fascinating about this. By the way, I forgot to mention this, that this is kolabat, I'm on a taper. I wanted the audience to be able to see what that actually looked like online.
Right.
Okay, so.
And I would just like to give a shout out to our listeners who are listening on Spotify or YouTube or Apple Podcast, wherever you are.
Sure.
If you go to YouTube or even our Spotify video, we have PowerPoint slides that are going with this, where you can read the quotes and you can see the actual timeline. And I know most of our listeners just listen, but I do think that's important to just give a shout out that if you want the full in-depth, make sure you watch the videos.
All right, so in this open letter to Quentin L. Cook, he says, I'm one of those formerly spiritually lost and apostate souls whose testimony was destroyed. That's a key word there. When something's destroyed, there's nothing left of it, right?
Sure.
Destroyed by falsehoods I found on the evil internets. But on Saturday night, following your advice at General Conference, I repented of my disillusionment, and it totally worked.
Right.
So he's
a little
mocking.
sarcastic.
Yeah. I used to believe a lot of vicious lies, all of which are vicious lies, all of which are found in LDS or LDS-friendly sources I read about on the evil internets. Lies about Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, the First Vision, the Book of Mormon, and everything else you can think of about the Lord's Church. In this article, if you look in the middle, in this posting, the author, the future author of the CES letter, breaks down in one sentence or one little mini paragraph each of these subject areas.
Okay.
And declares, that the Book of Mormon is not true, First Vision. But notice the similarity between those 6 areas that he focuses on and 6 of the principal areas that show up in the CES letter 6 months later.
They're identical.
Right.
I don't
now he
notice the
covers
difference.
other areas
Right.
in the CES letter too. But
CES letter increases.
but
So
these are,
just to give a shout out, it's Book of Mormon translation, First Vision, Book of Abraham, polygamy and polyandry, and prophets.
only he's stating these things not as questions, but as facts.
Right.
He's mocking the prophets. He's telling you the book of Abraham is not true. Right? There's no questioning in this open letter. And we went back in time in the story here to when his first, the author said that his faith crisis began in February of 2012. Okay. And that one of the first books he read several, but one of the first he read was Insider's View of Mormon Origins, which by Grant Palmer, which is another book that is an attempt to completely take down the Church of Jesus Christ and all of its foundational truths. Notice some of the similarities on the left there as you look at that.
They're very similar. We got Joseph Smith as a translator / revelator, authorship of the Book of Mormon, evangelical Protestantism in the Book of Mormon.
Focusing on the Book of Mormon, of course. Anybody can do that.
Right. Moroni and the Golden Pot. Well, witnesses to the gold plates, priesthood restoration, the first vision. Almost very, very similar / almost identical to what is in the open letter to Cook. And
when I was in the middle of this and I saw that, I went out to Amazon and I saw the title page and I looked at that and I had almost deja vu. Right. So on October 11th, he blasts the translation of the Book of Mormon because the Ouija board that Joseph used to con people in the treasure hunting days is the same Ouija board he used to translate the Book of Mormon. Mm-hmm. So does that sound like someone who's
open? Not really. And that those are exact words and exact nouns he uses in the CES letter itself, is talking about the translation of the Book of Mormon almost as a Ouija board and that whole process.
Yes, and I forgot to mention that the Kolobat attack on October 2nd of Brigham Young, that shows up twice in the CES letter.
Sure.
The one back on October 2nd. Okay, so October 25th, 2012, he posts again and directly attacks Joseph Smith. And he makes this claim that is nonsense, that 100% Latter-day Saint sources will prove that Joseph Smith is not a prophet. Mm-hmm. And so let's keep going. So now we're into November, and on the 11th, and you'll see some detail around this, and we're not going to touch on it much, but Kolobat actually coached a young man who was trying to persuade his father to leave the faith. And he directs him to go to Mormon Think for a resource. It's the only resource he mentions. And Mormon Think was one of the two sources that Runnels talked about in the early days of his faith crisis. He also ordered Brother Bushman's Rough Stone Rolling, which many people have read and had it increase their testimony.
Right. We interviewed Richard Bushman here on this podcast. We love Richard.
Right. But he mentions Mormon stories twice. So it was quite interesting. Did I say Mormon stories? No, he mentions Mormon Think twice. And so it's telling that he tells this young man, 8 months later, go to Mormon Think.
Mm-hmm. And what I would like to point out is he's persuading or coaching a young man to persuade his father to leave the church, while he himself is still a member of the church.
Exactly.
He's not yet left the faith.
The young man was already trying to do this with his dad, but he joined in and gave him some coaching.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right, so November 12th, he posts, how do I save my kids from the church? And one of the most telling things in this post is that he uses denigrating acronyms. He's picked up on the language of those who just hammer the faith, right? TSCC, the so-called church, TBM, and other names that are really meant to be derogatory.
So what does TBM stand for?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to.
True believing Mormon.
True believing Mormon, that could be pretty benign, right?
Uh-huh.
But the truth is that in the more hardened places on the web, it means totally brainwashed Mormon.
Sure.
Right. So, but it's used. But even when TBM is used on a mild basis, where it's really not super hostile, it's a put down.
Sure.
Right. So then, and then he talks about how he doesn't want his kids to be brainwashed into follow the prophet robots, and you can read more about that. That was all part of that. Now, on November 25th is a very telling posting. It's simply a link to a speech given by a videotape of a speech given by Grant Palmer. And remember, he's the one that was Insider's View of Mormon Origins, speaking at an anti-Latter-day Saint conference. Now, because I wanted to be thorough, I went out and watched that speech. And if you want to get depressed spiritually 5 or 10 minutes, go watch that speech.
Mm-hmm.
He denigrates the church. He mocks the living prophets. He talks about things that we just don't even want to sit through, right?
Mm-hmm.
That are denigrating to the faith. So that was, to me, very telling that he linked everybody out to that. So now in January, we have the new year coming on, and he dares young Latter-day Saints to leave the church. He says, "For those who are scared to live an authentic life because you will lose all your TBM friends or be alone, read this." And it's a quote from Robin Williams about it's better to be alone than with people that don't really appreciate you.
Sure.
Right? So he's kind of daring them, telling them, you're not really being authentic. If you have doubts in the church and you're young, it's not authentic to stay in the church. It's a devil's lie. It's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then you go to February 18th, and he formally requests, and by the way, right around this time, if you look on YouTube, Kerry Muhlestein was coming out with some very persuasive Book of Abraham videos.
Right.
If you've watched those.
And I will say we will be having Kerry Muhlestein here on the podcast here in, I think, 2 months or so he's going to be on. So look forward to some Book of Abraham with Kerry Muhlestein.
That'll be great.
Yeah.
That'll be awesome. Well, thoughts, rebuttals to Kerry Muhlestein's defense of the Book of Abraham? So he's asking for information. And one of the pieces of information that was in that video shows up in the CES letter. I don't want to necessarily say that it came from this request because we don't actually know that, but I thought it was quite interesting that one of those points shows up in the letter. So this is on February 18th. Now notice how close we're getting to the beginning of the writing of the essay. The essays, the beginnings of that was only 1 month later. Now on February 19th, there's an ugly smear of President Gordon B. Hinckley, where he talks about, and we only have a small part of it in this little blurb here, but basically it had to do with the way President Hinckley conducted himself during the Mark Hoffman. And I was a young adult during that period,
Right.
and I thought it was a magnificent display of integrity, that saying what he did know and admitting what he didn't.
Right. And we'll have a whole episode all about the Mark Hoffman forgeries and murders and stuff. And we're actually going to be, I think, in 2 or 3 episodes, our episode's going to be me, Steve Harper, and Sarah Allen, and we're going to talk a little bit about that Mark Hoffman trial. So it's a big part of all of this as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
On February 21st, he denounces the Book of Mormon and the leadership of the Church of Jesus Christ, quotes an essay, or quotes an Ensign article from then Elder Russell M. Nelson, where he talked about the translation. He talked about seer stones in the translation. We won't get off on that right now, but the point was he was denouncing the church in the discussion of that. On March, and then here we go, 1 month later, right, on March 26th, Kolobot announces on Exmo Reddit that he's writing his letter, and he sends a draft of it out with that posting.
Right.
And he asked, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm just doing math. This is 8 months after his very first post in July 2012. So I just want to point that out. That is quite a bit of time, a lot of studying, and finally he's starting to post. This is what I'm working on. Here's a draft. March 26th, 2013.
Yes. And he asks antagonists of the faith for feedback, advice, guys. Now, we're going to get into some detail about how they reacted to that. They knew what those 2 words meant,
right.
And it's evident in the dialogue back to him what they were talking about. So, all right, and then on April 12th, he posts the 77-page original essay to the Anti-Latter-day Saint Reddit channel in a Word format, as he had promised, and he invites the audience to share it with your loved ones and make it your own.
Right.
So this essay that was supposed to be directed only to the director is actually, he's telling them to share it with, make it your own, and share it with your loved ones. And they did. There was, he said in his John DeLynn interview in April, I think it was published in June of 2014, 1 year after the essay, he said that it got viral a little bit at this point.
Sure.
And we're not even to the point of sending it to the director yet.
Right.
And then on April...
I'd like to say at this point it's not polished. It's not what it is today. At this point it was 77 pages. Now in 2024 it's almost double the length. it's increased a lot after he got feedback and advice and further pushed it out to what it is today.
43% of the material that's in the current version of the CES letter, the director never saw it, or any of the flashy graphic design, the multiplicity of lead-in quotes, all the flashy stuff that was done.
And he has since translated it into multiple languages, so we can get this out to as many people.
That's
and it's not like he's sending it to multiple CES directors who speak other languages. He is sending it out to TBMs, to people who are on the fence of the church, not sure what they do or don't believe, and doing it in as many languages to get it out to as many people as he can.
Right, and we get into those things. So he sends it out to the director on the 22nd, and then just days later, through his own assent, his own conversation with the leader of the Mormon Think site, they together agree to post that letter on Mormon Think, and then it blows up.
Sure.
So this is just, that's when it really began. That was the first blow up on the internet that went large.
Yeah.
It just kept escalating from there. So, but he in tandem with Tom Phillips posted it on that site.
Where would we go from here, Michael?
Well, all these attacks were posted before a single word or question in the letter was even composed.
It's crazy to think. This is all, there's so much background that you don't even recognize, that you don't even know when you look at the letter and look at his introduction and what it is.
And this wasn't just one or two postings of somebody that was angry
Right.
in a faith crisis. This is a concerted effort,
It's
online
habitual
effort,
and it's repeated.
and it's growing,
Yep.
right? It's growing as we go, and now we're starting to ask for information, like with Milstein's
Right.
videos and so forth leading into this.
Right. And so now the second point I think we can move into, it's that there was disinterest in available and established channels for member questions. So he is putting this out there as if he has these questions and he wants these answers, but he's not going to the places he'll receive real answers. He's not going to the official representatives. Where is he going? What does that look like?
So it's a story. So let's go through that story. He had a family member, his grandfather, that heard through the family, no doubt, that he was dissenting from the faith. And so he tried to connect him up with a friend of his who was a church education system director. We know that all of this pretty much checks out. All of it does. So, and for perspective, there's over 150 CES directors around the world. It was one director. And this director reached out to him through an email about his concerns.
Yeah.
And then in response to that, he dived into, in late March, the writing of this essay, and then published it, as we just said, around April 20th or so.
Right.
So that's the background story. So, but one of the things that's very interesting is that nowhere in the exhaustive documentation of church interactions, which the author himself kept, I mean exhaustive, is found any detailed reference to having sought out, while in a faith crisis, local or higher authorities in the church. There's no record of that.
Right.
There's no inference of that. So here's what was actually going down. So if I'm in the middle of a faith crisis, which he was not, that had long since occurred, long before all of this. He was in a stage way beyond that, right? But when I am in a faith crisis and I'm struggling, the church has wonderful resources to assist us. We have our bishop, who's called of God to assist us in our own ward. We have a stake president who has delegated apostolic authorities given to him, certain authorities.
Right.
And most things can be resolved through a bishop or stake president. But if need be, it could go higher than that.
Right.
Stake president has the right to turn and say, this is a member that I think should see an area authority 70. And ultimately, it could go as high as the Quorum of the 12 in the First Presidency. Doesn't very often. It's a big church. But the reality is that the resources are many to get official information.
Right.
So he said he wanted official answers from official representative, but he essentially ignored the left half of this list on this slide.
Right.
Instead, he went to this CES, Church Education System Director, single director. Now let's talk about CES directors. Many of us have been influenced by CES employees wonderfully. They're fabulous human beings, and they've made a spiritual difference in countless lives, right?
Right.
But remember that these are high school and college religion teachers. There's over 150 of them, as I mentioned. They do not and cannot speak for the church. That's not their role. And they cannot give official answers for the church.
Right. They're not spokespeople for the church.
No. Or to say, this is the doctrine.
Right.
Right? This is the way this church interprets that incident in church history.
Right.
They don't have authority to do that.
Right.
So this distinction is missed by many youth and young adults in the church. One of the author's main target audiences, we're talking about teenagers and young adults, right? Who sometimes tend to think that anyone in the church, connected with the church, is an official authority. And the letter plays to this misperception. The story plays to this misperception, highlighting this lone CES director as highly authoritative.
Right.
And Brian Hales pointed out that the addressing, in his view, the addressing of the CES letter to a CES director was designed to give the letter credibility. So, however, this education system director in the end turns out to be more of an incidental actor, a kind of cipher who happened upon the unfolding central act. So he just happened into this story, right?
Right.
Namely, Runnels' advancing online crusade against the faith of Jesus Christ.
The interesting thing, I think, is that this person is the whole purpose, quote unquote, of the CES letter of I have these questions, I'm going to send it to the CES director and let's get some answers. But at this point, it doesn't matter who it's going to. What matters is the purpose of the letter and why he's written the letter and who the letter is being written to. And he's claiming it's this person when in reality it really is not.
No, and by his own admission.
Right.
As we're gonna show here in a few minutes. So the other thing I'd like to point out is I'd like to repeat that later on he was called to come in front of his leaders. They called him a year later, right, when he was called in to meet with his stake president.
Right.
But instead of, as I pointed out before, instead of using those as opportunities for resolution, all of those meetings, he instead used them to further attack the church and build his brand online and criticize the church online.
And record it and post it online.
Exactly. Okay, so number 3 is seeking feedback from church antagonists prior to publication. We just alluded to that when we went through the longer list. But here's the actual first posting. He calls the director this guy. And later on, he refers to him in a very casual way, the CES guy, right? This is a rough draft of what I'm sending over. Need your feedback, advice, guys. Now, notice what happens online immediately. If you go out on Reddit and research this and look at it, it's fascinating to watch the response to the initial draft. There's a guy out there named Big Mike SRT. He said, I think this is a great idea for a public edition. For future reference. I love how this reads as a legit letter. The flow is great, and I cannot wait to see someone even try to refute this without anything other than pray about it, follow the Spirit. Right. And then Kolobot responds, wow, thank you. So, in English we have this expression, knowing conversation, right? When two people are kind of being clandestine about something, they have their own way of speaking to one another, and it's called a knowing conversation.
Right.
And I'm not suggesting that this was a clandestine discussion, but this was a knowing conversation online. That there's immediate recognition from this church antagonistic audience that Runnels' packaging of his essay as a letter to obtain resolution of personal faith issues is a masquerade.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. So the audience out there on the anti-channel knew right off.
Yeah. They could tell just by the tone of the letter and who this person was who had already posted frequently before that.
And they're throwing data at him. They're saying things like, no, you got these points out of order.
Or add this
to is
to
a stronger argument against the faith.
Right.
You'll see it out there as they're doing this. Now, how much of that he claims he used very little of it, if any. But we don't know that. There's only one person that knows that.
Right.
Right. But we're not going to go there. That's not. We know that we're going to talk later about how much of the material was a regurgitation of the Tanners and Grant Palmer and so forth. So whether or not he crowdsourced it right here for the balance of the data is a secondary point to what we're talking about.
Right. And so he's constantly posting, crowdsourcing to, he's trying to respond to Fair's, what he calls Fair's hit piece on my, quote, a letter to a CES director. And so he's posting, crowdsourcing response to Fair number 1, Book of Mormon. I need people to respond on Fair's response to polygamy and polyandry. I need crowdsourcing on Fair's response to temple and spiritual witness. And he's leaving a link to those websites by Fair, and then asking people to help him hit back on each response.
On each topic. Now, this is crowdsourcing.
Right.
This is after the letter was published. Fair put up a couple of months later. They started doing their postings.
Right.
They were defending the church and debunking the letter. And he says he's going to write a response. The first thing he says is, I'd like your answers, rebuttals, ideas, sources, feedback. And you're sitting there, the average person sitting there thinking and saying, that's kind of funny. Because why would I do that why would I engage in a channel of argumentation when I'm really trying to get resolution?
Right.
Right?
Let me ask a question, and then let me immediately find every single reason why your answer is wrong.
Exactly. Yet this is the official, if you want to call it official, quote, but there's many like it. I mean, this is only one of many. It all started with questions. I needed official answers to those questions. This desire for answers and truth eventually led to a CES director crossing my path. He asked for those questions, and I gave them to him. He promised answers, but those answers never came. We're going to get into the tone of the letter and why I think it would be very rare for a priesthood leader to respond to something that ugly and that hostile
and condescending,
and the person is just beyond the point where you can even reason with them.
Right.
So, and then of course he says a week before, let me know what you guys think before I send. Right.
It's very interesting. As you and your partner Jacob Hess, as you guys have studied this, you've recognized your fourth point is that public statements by Jeremy reveal that he has a much broader intended audience. It's not just the CES director, and it's not just for himself, but it's a much broader intended audience. Could you kind of lead us through that? Who else is it intended to, and kind of what has your research shown in that field?
Right. So before I actually answer it, on his website, the author says of his letter, it was not written for the public, but it was written as a private letter. Note the words here, private letter between Jeremy and the CES director to seek answers to his questions. That's right on the website. And then in a 2014 email to the stake president, he says basically the same thing. It only exists because the director requested it, and I gave him sincere questions and concerns as per his request. But just 6 days after the publication, he's responding to another Reddit post. Somebody else is saying something, and then he's responding. He says, I didn't write this for the CES guy. 6 days after it was released.
Right. Very contradictory.
I didn't write this for the CES guy. And he says, I wrote it for a family member. I wrote it for family members to explain why I left the faith.
Right.
I didn't write this. But later on, he admits to a much broader audience. So about 6 months later, there was a responder on Reddit who questioned the order of things in the CES letter. He thought he should go after the prophet Joseph and do a character attack first, and instead of getting into the Book of Mormon like he does initially. And this was his response. If I'm going to have someone read 77 pages, we need to get them hooked immediately. And then these accusations about the book so beloved by Latter-day Saints were, the author admitted, his hook, adding, I go into the Joseph Smith stuff later, but the foundation has to be laid, and what better foundation than the very keystone of our religion?
Right.
So he's looking for a hook, right, for a broader audience.
Something easy. Let me get in there, get that, and then the rest of it can all fall down on top.
Exactly. So, and then later on, he admitted that the target audience are the fence sitters.
Right.
He was going after active Latter-day Saints who have doubts.
Right.
And that's clear in the writings on Reddit. So while it's apparent that he sent the essay to the CES director, that's not to whom he wrote it. His own words revealing a step-by-step strategy to implant doubt and thereby hook the actual intended readership, leading them away from faith in the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. I find it deeply offensive.
Right.
Deeply offensive.
Mm-hmm.
That someone would use the Book of Mormon and some mini attack upon it. And by the way, you can easily decimate that attack that's in the first part of the CES letter. It's kind of a joke. But they know that the book is beloved of us. So if he can make it appear that there's a problem with the Book of Mormon, he can get you hooked. He can get you to read the rest of this essay, which is progressively going to continue to bash the faith and then throw machine gun numbers of accusations against the church and the leaders at you.
Okay, so as we move forward, your next point, and I believe, how many points are we
Can I say one more thing on that topic?
Yeah.
So Sarah Allen revealed this, and I want to see if I can find this real quick. Sarah Allen is the one that exposed what I just gave you about the broader intent. And actually there were some others that did the same thing. So the author reacted to Sarah's exposure of this startling communication by contorting his own writing, claiming that in this post, the one that I just quoted here, where he was using the Book of Mormon as a hook to get them hooked immediately, that he was only talking about the CES director himself. Yet just before saying, if I'm going to have someone read 77 pages, he says this: they can pull out the scriptures to compare the italics. They can compare to the inspired version and see the problems for themselves, referring by this plural usage, of course, to members of the church generally and in plural. Everyone, he says, has a different button. My letter is an open source. It's yours to do as you will. So it's a very clear revealing of who the real audience was.
Exactly. And as he had first put it out in Word format, that allows people to take it and to edit it for themselves and to personalize and specialize for whoever their fence sitters are that they're trying to target in their proselyting of this.
Yes. All right. So we're down to textual similarities mirroring other published dissidents.
Right. So how many points are we going to be going over today? How many did you have prepared?
This is the last
great.
one.
Sounds good.
We have another piece that we're going to do right at the end.
And we're going to have a couple parts of this podcast with you. This is what we'll get to today, and then next week we'll publish the next episode, and you can look forward to part 2.
Okay, that looks great.
Cool.
That sounds great. So textual similarities mirroring other published dissidents. So in an interview that John DeLynn did with Jeremy Runnels a year after the publication, it was March, April timeframe, I think it was published a month or two later, Jeremy Runnels made the statement, which he had also made online, that it's not my information, meaning what's in the essay, and I stand on the shoulders of giants, the Tanners. Well, he's referring to Gerald and Sandra Tanner, who are very prolific anti-Latter-day Saint authors going back decades. Right.
Years and years and years before.
Yeah, and widely dismissed by scholars for terrible scholarship and extreme bias against the faith, taking any little thing and making the church look bad, because of it. To the degree that a lot of people won't even read anything from the Tanners when they're looking at critical sources. So it's that kind of reputation. So the fact that he's bringing up the Tanners is significant. So in this earliest interview, he admits that when his initial doubts began, I first read Insider's Guide to Mormon Origins by Grant Palmer, and I went to Mormon Think. He also went to Fair, and he also ordered the book I told you about, Rough Stone Rolling. But this church hostile site, Mormon Think, is mentioned twice as an early significant influence. And ultimately, we already went over this, the outline of Palmer's book bears a striking resemblance to the CES letter itself, the general outline, right? And as Sarah Allen demonstrated, a good deal of the essay's writing and illustrations, often word for word, appear to be lifted from these and other church hostile references, or they're rephrased. One person reading the CES letter said, it's the God-makers all over again. And the God-makers came from the Tanners. So you see where we're going, right? Yeah. So hold on. And then he says in this interview, the Tanners, they're the real hipsters. I stand on the shoulders of giants, the Tanners and other prominent antagonists, and all I've done was compile many of their work and put it in my own style and narrative. What I did was I took their research and their insights and their works, and I put it in a way that worked best for me, that explained my train of thought in terms of why I obviously no longer believed in the church. And then DeLynn responds by saying, it's almost like a condensed version of Mormonism's shadow or reality. He's saying that the CES letter is like a condensed version. In a sense, it's like several inches thick. It's like this is a lot thinner. And then Runnels nods his head and says, yeah. You could even see it as a distillation. Runnels says, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So what the author essentially did was repackage the corrosive Tanner and Palmer writings, so intuitively repulsive to sincere believers, within an attractive truth seeker storyline. A story, right? That's the package.
That same packaging we talked about earlier.
Right. A storyline custom designed to appeal to anyone curious enough to pick it up.
Right.
So well before sending the letter to the director, the author embraces, aligns with, and positions himself alongside some of the most prominent and antagonistic detractors of the Church of Jesus Christ. In fact, leaders in the anti-Latter-day Saint community, and says, I stand on the shoulders of giants.
Right.
So he's obviously got something great planned, right? He's aligning himself with these very public, very prolific authors.
Right.
Who fight against the restored gospel
right,
of Christ. So this took place even before completing the final draft or putting the finishing touches on the letter.
Right.
Which was presented afterward, after. He's got that introduction. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But after it was published, ever after, it's presented as merely an attempt by a dissenting and doubting member to get deeply felt concerns answered in order to restore his faith in the Church of Jesus Christ. And that's the story that's on the very front page of his website right now in the upper fold.
Right when you get there, it is the first thing you see is this introduction.
I'm going to read it here.
Okay.
Now think about what we've talked about here so far, and think about it in that context as I read this. CES Letter, my search for answers to my Mormon doubts. CES Letter is one Latter-day Saints' honest quest to get official answers from the LDS Church on its troubling origins, history, and practices. Jeremy Runnels was offered an opportunity to discuss his own doubts with the director of the church education system and was assured that his doubts could be resolved. After reading Jeremy's letter, the director promised him a response. No response ever came. So
it's a powerful introduction. We do have to give that to Jeremy. It is a powerful introduction.
Yeah. Only we find out that it's false.
Right. It's a fictional introduction.
It's completely false, right? We've already gone over that. Now we're going to talk for a minute here about what I'll call Runnels' response.
Okay.
So Sarah Allen, in 2021, when she wrote that Dishonest Origins of the CES Letter, Runnels reacted, I would say, with deep hostility online.
Right.
It's if you were even to look at it, I don't recommend you do this. If you were to look at what he did, what he wrote in 2021, it's a public smear of a very good person. It is completely personal, and he keeps coming back. It's like he keeps coming back to quoting his introduction and what he said in the introduction, and then he rambles on and pounds Sarah over and again. Then he comes back and puts the introduction up, and then he pounds her again, and then he puts it up. It's terrible.
Right.
It's a really horrible thing. But so let's look at his introduction. Let's just look at it in depth here.
Right.
So right after telling the CES director, I'm interested in your thoughts and answers, as I've been unable to find official answers from the church for most of these issues. I'm hoping you're going to have better answers. Runnels writes the following in the third paragraph. Now, before we read this, I want to point something out. So this covers about 3/4 of a page, and then it immediately goes into the Book of Mormon arguments.
Okay.
There's no preliminaries at all. In the 2013 edition, there's no table of contents. There's no grand buildup. It's just, I think that's very telling.
Right.
Very short introduction, and then boom, 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 rat-a-tat-tat-tat, right? So he says here, Runnels writes in the third paragraph, I'm just going to be straightforward and blunt in sharing my concerns. Obviously, I'm a disaffected member who lost his testimony, and so it's no secret which side I'm on at the moment. All this information is a result of over a year of intense research and an absolute rabid obsession with Joseph Smith and church history. With this said, I'd be pretty arrogant and ignorant to say that I have all the information and that you don't have answers. Like you, I put my pants on one leg at a time and I see through a glass darkly. You may have new information and or a new perspective that I might not have heard or considered before. This is why I'm genuinely interested in what your answers and thoughts are to these troubling problems. Now, this is what Runnels comes back to and quotes over and over again.
Right.
I was up front with you.
Mm-hmm.
The subtitle was How I Lost My Testimony.
Mm-hmm.
That's straightforward. This is all what I said it was.
Right.
Right?
Exactly.
But it's almost like you're taking this out of time, out of context. Because look what's been going on for 6 months
Mm-hmm.
leading up to the publication of this. Look at what's in the text of this very essay right after this introduction.
Right.
And then look at everything he did immediately after that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So we're going to put this in the proper context.
Okay.
So right up front in the introduction, he tries to persuade his audience that though he's caustically denouncing the Church of Jesus Christ throughout this essay, he's somehow at the same time open to new information that might fundamentally alter his entrenched acid-tone view of the faith.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't sound like human nature, does it?
Right.
And not only does the above paragraph directly conflict with the author's own actions before and after sending the letter, it doesn't line up with the text of the original essay itself. With its 175 faith-hostile questions and a plethora of hard-edged church attacks crammed into 77 pages.
Right.
Because his questions are not really questions.
No, none of them really are.
No, and when you learn rhetoric in high school or college or whenever you learn it, you learn that a sincere question is meant to invite other perspectives and a dialogue and real response, right? But a question can be used as a dagger, a dart, a knife. It can be used as a bashing tool.
Right.
And that's exactly what he does, 175 bashes of the faith in the form of a question where there was really no intent to get any answers. Right.
And something that Steve Harper points out is if we could answer the individual questions, do you think we'd change his mind? Probably not.
That's a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So we threw in here at face value, any English teacher reading it would likely feel compelled to say, reading the introduction and then reading the essay, wow, the rest of your paper doesn't really match what you say in the introduction about being interested in the thoughts of the other person. Can you help me understand? Just describe. A plain, fair reading of the original text reveals that single paragraph as a jarring clash with the subsequent hundreds of other paragraphs which repeatedly and pointedly argue against the truthfulness of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So there's just no there's no melding of the two. Right. Now, this is another point here. There's a second point here. It's important to realize that at this very time, I say this very hour, but we mean over a period of a couple of weeks, right, when this was written, and when he was doing what he was doing. Runnels was also simultaneously, at the time that he's writing these final drafts and he's putting this introduction on the essay, at the same time, he was simultaneously test driving the hostile essay on the church antagonistic subreddit. Sure. He's honing his all-out attack upon the faith. He was even thanking some responders who praised the letter for what they saw as an airtight takedown of the restored Church of Jesus Christ truth claims.
I think the interesting thing that this whole section I keep coming back to is just the fact of how many people he tricked. Mm-hmm. How many people from that first paragraph, from that first introduction, they read it and you immediately dive in and you say, oh, I feel for this man. I want to be somebody for
how
this.
Many good people.
So many good people. And even my teammate, Steve Harper, when he first reads it, he is concerned and he feels bad. And one time we were talking and he said, gosh, dang, that CES director, he's a loser. Something to that effect, because that's immediately your thought process is, let's bring this man in, give him a hug and help him feel loved and give him the ministering and give him the answers that he needs.
Right.
And then as you start to learn this, you start to feel a little bit hurt. As you start diving into the letter itself, as somebody who cares for people like Jeremy Reynolds, people who have those questions, it's hard because you know the answers don't matter. The questions don't matter. He is not, the purpose of it is not to find answers to his Mormon doubts, as he says.
Right. Exactly. So it's sad, really sad.
It is.
And a lot of, like I said, a lot of very good people were misled.
Right.
And at the same time, those people weren't misled, many of them, to the degree that they would agree with what was in the letter.
Absolutely.
Many of them argued against it.
Right.
And wrote long rebuttals of it and so on. But generally speaking, many people, even among that group of very good folks, were like Brother Harper, right?
Right.
To throw his arms around the guy for his problem.
And the thing I would like to point out is many of our listeners, I'd say a large percentage of our listeners, have the same questions that are posed in the CES letter. The questions in it are important. The topics in it are important. And we need to dive in. And as we always talk about here in the CES letters is, what do you know and how do you know it? That is vital and that is important.
Yeah.
But what is just as important is doing it in an honest way by study and by faith.
Exactly.
To seek learning by study and by faith. And that is not what this is. Out of the best books, this is not the best book.
Right.
We need all perspectives.
But the general topics are all really key topics in the restoration. If we're just talking about what the general subject matter is, not what position you take on the truthfulness of it, but what is the general topic.
Yeah.
Then you're talking about the Book of Mormon, its content. You're talking about how it was translated, which is a wonderfully miraculous event, right? You're talking about the first vision, probably the most sacred heavenly visitation that we've had in this dispensation. Right?
Exactly.
You're talking about the restoration of the priesthood, which gives the authority for Jesus Christ's church to operate.
Right.
And more, right? So these are sacred topics. Now, I'd like to just describe the slide just for a brief moment. So what was really happening behind the scenes is Reynolds wrote this paragraph in his introduction. On the left-hand side, he was writing the introduction. He was also doing the editing, right, on the piece.
Right.
But at the very same hour, he's out hustling the essay online.
Right.
And at the bottom, we show what he said was the dates in which the essay was actually written, between March 22nd and April 13th. But as you look at the slide on the right, what is it? What would that be? That's 3 days later. He's posting initial draft on Reddit and asking for feedback, advice. And then on the 12th is when he published, he says he published the actual final draft with a Word copy and told his audience to send it to loved ones and make it your own.
Right.
That's on the 12th. Finishes up on the 13th, according to the time frame at the bottom of the page, right?
Right.
And then about a week later, after all of this, on about April 20th, does he finally send the letter to the director.
The CES director.
So we're going to get into a little bit of the content here.
And something I'd like to point out is this April 12th.
Of the introduction, I mean.
Yeah, this April 12th letter that he posts in Word format, there are still updates to come. It still increases in size. It's polished. I believe the most recent update, you correct me if I'm wrong, is 2018. I believe 2017.
Yeah.
And so it continues to go through drafts as he makes it more polished, and as he gets rebuttals, he tries to.
Right, which makes you wonder: is it still a letter?
Exactly.
It can't be a letter.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And then he publishes it as a book that you can buy online, and continues from there.
Exactly.
So where are we going from here, Michael?
We're going to just talk about the nature of the content versus the introduction. So this is just one small part of the relevant evidence. The author's public words and actions over the previous 9 months, July 12 to April 2013, we're still talking about this introduction.
Yeah.
Right? Demonstrate his true state of mind at the actual time he was writing this essay, that he had long before passed far beyond any answer-seeking stage of faith crisis.
Right.
Sincere answer-seeking stage, right? Now, I'm just going to go through this. I'll try to be concise here.
Okay.
But after the opening salutation to the director, his name's at the top of the original version, just like, right? Across 77 pages thereafter, not once does the author actually address him by name in the essay. There's no sense of dialogue as he goes along, right? And there's not even a closing salutation or a reference to the director after that. In fact, it's a heated wind-up to a thundering conclusion and a flat-out declaration that the church is false. that he's out and not likely to return. And in fact, he adds a short poem at the end describing his appealing new life outside the faith, having left it all behind.
Mm-hmm.
So there isn't the slightest inference in the body or the ending of the essay that he would like answers or his concerns resolved to restore his testimony as he publicly claimed,
Right.
and brand it as part of his story for many years afterward.
Right.
Instead, these are some of the examples of some of the language in the actual essay. So he says the Book of Abraham issues are, quote, the smoking gun that has completely obliterated my testimony. He says, and this is his language, I should have put that part in quotes there on the next paragraph. Hill, Cumorah, and Moroni have absolutely nothing to do with Cumorah and Moroni from Captain Kidd's stories. This is where he's machine gunning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Stories that Joseph and his treasure-hunting family and buddies were familiar with. The original 1830 Book of Mormon uniform Cumorah spelling. Notice there's a question mark every time,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is all just a mere coincidence. This is on page 9. Now, this is another section. If these witnesses literally saw the plates like everyone else on the planet sees tangible objects, why strange statements like, I never saw them only as I see through a mountain? Question mark. What does that even mean? Question
Mm-hmm.
mark. It's not. It's taking Martin Harris completely
Right.
out of
Mm-hmm.
context. But I don't know if it's Martin Harris or David Whitmer, but it doesn't matter, right? I've never seen a city through a mountain. Have you? Why all these bizarre statements from the witnesses if the plates were real and the event literal? Why would you need a vision or a supernatural power to see real physical plates that Joseph said were in a box that he carried around? Question mark. These are right after another. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat, right? When Martin Harris was asked, but did you see them with your natural, your body eyes, just as you see this pencil case in my hand? Question mark.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the kind of, on one page, there is over 20 questions asked in just a few paragraphs
Mm-hmm.
like this. Just questions as bludgeoning tools, right? Okay, so he says Joseph's actions over several years, quote, are not congruent with honest behavior. Quote, Joseph Smith's pattern of behavior or modus operandi for a period of at least 10 years of his adult life was to keep secrets, be deceptive, and be dishonest, both publicly and privately. This is the kind of language that you're seeing in this thing, right? Okay. Repeatedly attacks the character. He repeatedly attacks the character of the three witnesses directly.
Right.
Now, he slams many modern prophets and apostles by name, including Russell Nelson, Dallin Oaks, Boyd K. Packer, and he uses a lot of declarative statements such as yesterday's doctrine is today's false doctrine, and yesterday's prophet is today's heretic. He repeats that 3 times.
Mm-hmm.
Accuses the Church of Jesus Christ, our faith, of being a cult. And then he talks about LDS Church almost like he's at arm's length to it, right? He speaks as someone far removed, whitewashing its origin and history. And he uses the word whitewash 3 times
Right.
in the actual essay. Regarding race and the priesthood issues, quote, I'm supposed to believe in a God who is a schizophrenic racist. But now we're thinking back to the introduction and the kinds of things he was saying in the introduction, right? Now this is the next part, and this has been widely quoted,
Okay.
right? I don't even want to read what he said about God the Father, but that's what he said,
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus Christ the Son.
Right.
He's accusing them of horrific things,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then our Savior Jesus Christ, he calls him the crazy God of the Old Testament. And then he goes after the Holy Ghost. So this is somebody who is denouncing God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Ghost in some of the ugliest of terms.
Right. He says Christ is a crazy God of the Old Testament. He says, is the Holy Ghost the best that God could come up with in revealing his truth to his children? He says that God endorses murder and genocide and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I would not say that is somebody who is even open to the idea of a God or the Godhead.
And the context around that Holy Ghost quote was his almost mocking of people who get up and bear their testimony in sacrament meeting and say that they know that God lives and that
Right.
Jesus is the Christ. You go right into the scriptures, and that's exactly how the prophets bear their testimony.
Right.
Right. So it's pure testimony.
Right.
Yeah, from the Holy Ghost, and it goes after the Holy Ghost. So, our living prophets of God. Why would I want my kids singing Follow the Prophet with such a ridiculous 183-year track record? What credibility do the brethren have? And so on, right? So, God the Father, Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, and their living prophets. I would say that's about, those 4 together are about as close to the core of our doctrine.
It's the first 4 Temple Recommend interview questions.
The foundational piece, and denouncing them and mocking them, and then what's this introduction about wanting to get questions answered, and maybe you have an idea or two that I haven't thought of.
Right.
Yeah. So none of this is what you say or what you do when you're genuinely interested in new information, thoughts and answers to sincere questions. So from the entirety of the evidence, it's apparent that the introductory paragraph was inserted to just disarm readers,
right,
and give the author an appearance of reasonableness, even implying that he was curious about additional information the respondent may have. And yet that pretense was more spin. It was another deception. And we make this point at the end of this. This introductory paragraph is no defense at all, none, for the obvious misleading of Runnels' audience. But instead, it gives the public even more evidence of the author's fraud. So you may want to look through this slide. This is from last Friday at Fair.
Yep. Would you like me to read this paragraph?
Please.
In an August 8th, 2024 presentation examining new evidence, acclaimed historian Dr. Stephen C. Harper concluded, quote, "The author was not an honest truth seeker. As many, many people have done, I took for granted that he was who he said he was. I was one of many, who knows how many thousands, who read the CES letter and wanted to wrap my arms around Jeremy Runnels and say, man, that sucks. I wish that stupid CES guy had been better to you. And that's just not what happened. That is not the truth." Powerful statements.
Very powerful. And think about this too. Oh, you're not addressing the content of the letter. You're just going after the author. Or it doesn't matter if he wasn't straight up with this large story that enticed people into the letter. It doesn't matter. What's in the letter matters. You know what? It does matter. It matters a lot. And I think a decent analogy is, imagine, we have a lot of people knocking on our door trying to sell us stuff, right? So imagine somebody knocks on your door, and he's very charming, and he gives you a pitch about himself, about his background, about what his purpose is for being on your doorstep, what he wants, what he's trying to do. And so you listen, it sounds appealing. You invite him into the anteroom. A lot of houses have that little anteroom right off the front door. You sit and you talk to him for maybe a minute or two. It's getting more reasonable. So you invite him into the living room. You actually invite him down the hall to sit in the sofa of your living room and talk to you. Then after a while, you discover that this whole package, this whole pitch was false. Now, that's going to color, will it not, anything he says thereafter?
It should.
Especially when we're dealing with issues where somebody can read a book or read material who's full of faith, and they can get down to the nitty-gritty and come up with the decision that I can resolve this with church history.
Right.
It makes sense to me. Whereas somebody else who's very, very critical, maybe looking at different sources that are interpreting it a different way, come up with a completely different conclusion.
Right.
So a lot of it is subjective. And so since it's those kinds of arguments, then this does matter a very big deal. And that's why Sarah Allen said that it was an evidence of a problem with the document itself in terms of its truthfulness. We're talking about the CES letter in general. So it's very exciting to witness the many people who have been negatively affected by the CES letter who have come back, people who have taken their names off the records of the church, been rebaptized. Over the last 2-3 years, we have dozens of stories representing what I believe is a much larger group, right, that are on the Comeback podcast. They're on Saints Unscripted, and I understand Saints Unscripted's got a new spin-off channel where they're doing a lot more of these kinds of stories, but they already had quite a few.
Right.
And then what's on Faith Matters, if you go to the Faith Matters website, people who bought into the letter, bought into its content, left the faith, either removed their records or didn't, who are now back enjoying the fruits of the gospel of Christ and our Heavenly Father and having all the blessings of the gospel in their lives.
Right.
I think that's a very exciting trend in the faith right now.
It really is exciting. And that's really what our goal is here with the CES Letters podcast, is to dissect it, to go through the questions and concerns both found in the CES letter, but then just the current concerns and questions about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and to give a different perspective. We have this perspective. It's okay to seek different perspectives. Get this perspective and then get our perspective, which we have sought learning by study and by faith. We have tried to understand, what do we know? How do we know it? Dive into Joseph Smith's journals, dive into the papers, and see what is the truth with these things.
Exactly.
And then we can make a fair and an informed decision. But we need a study. It's okay to get the different perspectives. Let's get the different perspectives. And then by study and by faith, we can make an answer to faithful things.
Right, and we don't have time now to get into all of the individual stories, but it's astonishing to see a thread running through those return stories.
Right.
Somebody who was just really steeped in the CES letter completely. His wife, Bridger Coburn, his wife invited him to, a state conference, and he went right when he was in the middle of the most negativity and had left the faith and everything. And he was in state conference, and he was feeling he started to feel the Spirit in the middle of the meeting. And he thought, this doesn't comport. What's going on here?
Right.
And so he went back and he began a even more in-depth study. He'd already done a lot of study, but now he started to open the door to faithful sources and to other scholars, and he started to doing a side-by-side comparison. And I'm giving you spoilers because he's got a wonderful video that he does on Saints Unscripted about this from a couple of years ago. But you see that thread running through the stories of people coming back, that they had their own individual faith experience with God directly, despite all of this, right? Or they read the Book of Mormon. Many of them, it's the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is the great benefit that can bring a person back in almost every case. Right. It can bring a person back. So anyway, I've really enjoyed being here.
I've loved this, Michael. Michael, as we conclude, I would just love, could you just share a brief testimony, your brief spiritual and proclamation of what you know to be true? You have dived into the CES letter deeply. You know it. You know the author. What is your testimony? How have you continued on in the faith?
I decided to do an in-depth study of all 7 key areas that are covered in this essay and in others. And what I was able to find was that there's always a resolution to every question, ultimately. You might not get it immediately, but if you dig deep, like you were saying, into the sources that are credible and reliable, and the more you get to original sources, the better. Right. You know, Richard Bushman said the more you're reading about the prophet Joseph from his own writing and from his own documents, the better he looks, right? Yeah. It's an example. So that's part of it. But I have to tell you that I was brought to understand the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the gospel when I was 17 and a half, about 6 months before I graduated from high school. And it was in ideal circumstances. I was in the community I lived in was only 7% Latter-day Saint in northern Idaho. And I had fabulous friends who were, we were in music together, and there was quite a group around me who were Latter-day Saints, so I knew nothing about the church. But before long, I was in front of missionaries. And over a period of weeks, I experienced the Holy Ghost in such a profound way, night after night after night, that there was no doubt whatsoever that this really is the Church of Jesus Christ. It's his restored gospel. It really is. And nothing that's out there can take away from that truth. It cannot. You know, God's the one our Father in heaven is the one that created this world. Right. Created all the information that's in it. It's not going to contradict that revelation. In the end, it won't. It will not. And I've been blessed to have sacred things in my life that have happened to me. And I know without a doubt about the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon, God the Father, Jesus Christ, the principles of the gospel, the prophet Joseph. And I can just say that I got to witness over the last 2 years. My wife and I have been temple and family history coordinators in our ward. And the ward that we just moved, but the wonderful ward we just moved from, the person in that ward is the average age is around age 23 to 35.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of this young adult group
Right.
that encounters a lot of this. And we had 3 couples, and they all have different stories. They all have different circumstances in their lives. Active, less active, not active at all, who were brought to get into the gospel again. And within a year and a half, all 3 were sealed in the temple. And that was another example to me, another witness to me of what we're talking about right here.
Right.
It is possible for people who even now have bitter feelings or hard feelings toward the church or toward other things, maybe family situations or whatever, to be healed, to be restored, and to actually have a stronger testimony than they ever had in the past. That's what many say when they come back. But that's the long answer to your question.
That's a good answer. Amen. Praise Jesus. Hallelujah. Michael, thank you very much. This has been a pleasure talking with you today.
I've really enjoyed it.
And this is part 1 of a couple parts. So I want to thank our listeners. I know this was a little bit longer of an episode, but I want to thank you for listening, for taking the time to be with us today. I hope that you'll listen to part 2, and as we dive into the CES letter itself, but then the topics and histories as well. We hope that you share this with your friends, with your family, the truth seekers in your life, and those who need to hear more of this truth. We thank you guys, and we'll talk to you next time.